Major depressive disorder is a mood disorder which causes a persistent feeling of sadness. Now, this is not your typical sadness. Depression causes a loss of interest in your normal day-to-day activities. It affects how you feel, how you think, and even how you behave. It can lead to a host of emotional as well as physical problems, and even make you feel as though life is not worth living. Today, we will open the discussion on depression and take a look at the effects the pandemic has had on those who battle this illness. Also, we'd like to remind those who battle, as well as those who don't, that it's okay to not be okay. And always remember that depression is treatable. Joining me today are some counselors from Regent University's Psychological Services Center in Virginia. Today, we're going to discuss the effect the pandemic has had on those who battle depression, as well as, again, remind those who battle, as well as those who don't, that it's okay to not be okay. And most importantly, that depression is treatable. So these are things that we want to keep out there, reminding people of. And so hopefully that it will become a part of them, and they'll be able to understand it. It'll resonate with them, and they'll be able to understand that this is no different than any other illness that people battle in terms of its validity. So the music industry, as we know, lost a legend recently, Naomi Judd, due to mental illness, right? And it was mentioned that the pandemic was especially difficult for her. Why is it that the pandemic is especially harder on those with depressive, major depressive disorder?
The isolation is hard. The uncertainty about the pandemic it causes a lot of anxiety. It causes a lot of hopelessness. That, you know, if this thing is not going away, what does that mean about life? And if there are some of the feelings of worthlessness or hopelessness or fatigue that comes with depression, or like even just like a depressed mood or lack of interest in doing something that you used to like doing, the pandemic can impact that and kind of amplify it.
How do you help someone battling depression navigate through changes, right? Or difficult times? How do you help someone navigate through those times? Because should we expect that it might be really difficult for them and maybe put them in a really bad place? Or do we just wait and see how they manage it? How do we help them manage those difficult times? Sadness, grief and pandemics.
Asking them, like, what do you need from me right now? Instead of asking things like, are you okay? That's just like a question that's like yes or no. Whereas like, how can I support you, or how can I be here for you right now, opens up room for that person to express how it might be more helpful for you to respond, rather than just going to fixing the problem or offering some kind of solution.
Yeah, I think it can be difficult to navigate, and it also can be difficult to identify because there are different types of depression, and it's difficult to differentiate what a person is experiencing, specifically when they're not depressed every single day, or they're not experiencing sadness, or they feel, I hate to use this word, but normal some days. And so it's like, I'm not depressed, because there's like a misconception of what depression looks like, and there are different types. So sometimes depression comes in mood swings. Sometimes depression looks like, I've been dealing with it for 2 years, but I had 3 months where I haven't felt that at all. So how do I tell someone, even a friend, a family member, someone that they trust, or a professional, that I am sad, but not all the time? Like, I don't want to put myself out there if I'm really not dealing with anything. And so that can be difficult for the person who needs that help. So I think it's really important for individuals to go to a professional who is comfortable and competent in identifying what these episodes are.
So we heard about the deadly potential, right, of the effects of COVID-19, and how to protect ourselves. And even now, how to protect ourselves as we're kind of coming on the downslope of it. How can those who battle depression or have major depressive disorder, how can they protect, or should they be protecting their mental state during this time?
You're right. We got almost like flooded with all of these things that we can do to protect our physical health. And there was definitely psychological impacts through the pandemic, like Sean mentioned, flexibility, isolation, previous risks or presentation of mental health. And we got very little public support or very obvious support on how we can deal with those things. And I think we've already mentioned some things that can help us almost take like a preventative stance against mental illness. Eating well, eating nutritious meals, has tons of benefits when it comes to, your brain needs certain nutrients to keep functioning. And when you don't fulfill those basic needs for exercise and good balanced meals, then you're just putting yourself at a higher risk to be affected when life throws challenges at you, because you're not physically doing as good as you could do. You're almost creating like a soft spot to be triggered.
In your practice, did you come across people maybe that this may have held true for, where they found themselves in a situation where they were dealing with these feelings and emotions that they never experienced before, brought on by the pandemic?
There are definitely people who probably experienced depression for the very first time during the pandemic. And like Sean mentioned, there are many reasons for why that could be, probably multiple reasons, all contributing to that. People who maybe didn't adjust very well to the pandemic, or were very social beings, and suddenly found themselves isolated away from their support system. That could have been the very first time that they didn't have people to talk to or go to. There's such a social aspect to depression. I mean, we have treatments that solely focus on the interpersonal relationships that can lead to depression. And so we know that having that social support system is crucial to our just psychological well-being as humans.
I also wanted to add that stressful life events are well recognized as a precipitating factor of the onset of major depression or a depressive disorder. It's not the defining factor, but when stress is significant, pervasive, or constant, that is one of the contributing factors to a person to feel depressed or sad or overwhelmed or guilty in a way that they've never experienced before.
When you look at the pandemic and it caused, social distancing and isolation, and when you think of someone who has major depressive disorder, the thought is they become reclusive and want to stay inside, and they don't want to be active, and they don't have the energy to be active in anything. And so when you bring on the pandemic and you're faced with isolation and social distancing and people not being around one another, one would think that would not be stressful for someone with major depressive disorder, but it seems the opposite, that just compounded it. Why is that so?
I can jump in and speak to that. I think a huge piece that Danita already mentioned, right, is our need for social interaction, our need for community. And I think, even people who are really battling with depression still have that need. And unfortunately, a lot of times it goes unaddressed, as many people, when they encounter someone with depression are like, oh, we need to give that person their space. But I think a huge part of that is, when the pandemic came on and when a lot of people were really realizing, oh, I'm really in a, difficult spot mental health wise. There wasn't a lot of outlets in terms of people that were checking in on other people. I think a lot of that was really driven by the fear of the pandemic, driven by the fact that, people could contract COVID from one another. And so I think that had a huge part to play in really kind of limiting definitely social interaction, but even to some degree, social communication as well.
With things returning back to normal now, right? More people are going out, the gatherings are allowed, people are not wearing masks and so much. And is it harder now for them to reacclimate back into society, or into the normal, I should say, not necessarily society, but into the normal practices before the pandemic?
Depression looks different for everybody, and kind of how they battle it the same way also looks really different. So for some people, kind of the lifting of, pandemic regulations may have been seen as a big blessing, in terms of kind of getting activated and getting back into at least having people surrounding them that can really encourage them to do some of the things that, as I said, really activate them or are pleasurable to them. But I think for others, that may have been a huge fear.
So I think the pandemic opened up and kind of exposed people who have trouble adjusting to some of the new norms, because the media was on board with the fact that people were experiencing behaviorally and emotionally different things as a result of this nationwide pandemic or sickness. So that opened the door to, like Genevieve and Danita was saying, new ways to reach mental health professionals. I'm an advocate for mental health professionals, so that's always going to be my go-to. And then after that, it'll be people you support, who you believe can support you, and then people that you trust, and then loved ones. But number one is the qualified mental health professionals. So they were more accessible. Virtual resources became an option for people. Free counseling became available for all people. And I think the pandemic is a blessing and a curse, but a blessing in regards to people like us being able to reach more people, not missing those who may not have insurance or transportation to get to the appointment. But now we can enter into a person's home without them leaving it.
I like that you highlighted that professional help is a must, right? In most cases, it's a must. When does the untrained person, when is it, I guess, too much for them, and when should they seek help for their loved one that they're trying to help? And how should they go about doing that?
Yeah, so I can jump in and speak to that a little bit. I think kind of a general rule of thumb that we have is if, someone's depressed mood is really lasting for more than kind of what our clinical diagnosis of a 2-week period, or if it's causing really serious interference with someone's life, in the work aspect, social aspect, family aspect, as well as certainly if somebody's, having ideas or has a plan about suicidality, that's definitely a huge, flag that we really should get somebody actively involved who's, a trained mental health professional. So I think everybody should have some awareness of at least those 3 things, of kind of, especially when things are, looking a little different for someone that they care about.
Highlight or just explain some of the different types of depression that people experience.
Depression in individuals between the ages of 6 and 18 can be irritable or angry. And so that is what we call depressive mood dysregulation disorder, right? And so that's persistent anger that's out of proportion to the event. And so that's going to look different from major depressive disorder, where you will have about 5 out of 9 symptoms present for most of the day, like sadness, diminished interest in things that you used to enjoy, or sleeping too much or not enough, or eating too much or not enough, or feeling worthless or guilty. It could also be an inability to concentrate like a person typically is used to, or those recurrent thoughts of death. It could be with or without a plan, and that has to last between at least 2 weeks. Right? And then you have another form of depression, which is more long-standing, and this is called persistent depressive disorder. And this lasts for about 2 years with some of the same symptoms of major depressive disorder: sadness, depressed mood, not eating, not sleeping, diminished ability to concentrate, but it lasts longer. So you can have those episodes like I was talking about earlier, where you go for 2 or 3 months without a depressive episode at all, and then it comes back and it's long-standing, longer than a 2-week episode of major depression. But major depression can be prevalent within the depressive disorder that's persistent, and we also call that dysthymia. Then you have a postpartum depression, which is common among mothers, which is that deep sadness or mood swings after a person, a mom, has their child. And you also have seasonal affective disorder. And that's when the seasons change, typically in the colder months where we're more locked in and enclosed, and we start to experience sadness or depression, or just not feeling as good as we used to feel during some of those spring and summer months.
So are some of these types of depression that you mentioned, are some of them chemical imbalances or hormonal imbalances?
Depression is not just a chemical imbalance. I think for some of the more persistent things, persistent types of depression, we can see a little bit more of a chemical influence, as far as like neurotransmitters in your brain, and like lower levels of serotonin in your brain, that kind of give you that mood boost and that energy and that kind of push to move sort of thing. With major depressive disorder and with seasonal affective disorder, some of them can actually be environmental as well. A lot of environmental influences, such as changes in like life status, like if you are single after being in a long-term relationship, or if you're moving to a new area, or if you are having a hard time making friends, or if something did happen, like a trauma of some sort maybe, and you have a harder time with seeing the normal in your life still happening, or like the way that you usually respond to a thing is not happening anymore, and you're having a harder time concentrating or something like that, it can kind of have like a compound effect where you kind of feedback loop on yourself and kind of think about like, I can't do my schoolwork, and it's making me feel bad about myself, it's just making it harder to do schoolwork, which is making me feel worse about myself, and it's kind of like this feedback loop a little bit. And so there are a lot of environmental factors.
Thanks, Sean, for that, because it made me think about how normal it is for us as humans to contract things that our relatives have had. And it's just like any other condition, right? If my mom's mom had high blood pressure, then I may be at risk for having high blood pressure. So it's the same thing with this type of condition. First degree family members of individuals with major depressive disorder have a higher risk, and it's 2 to 4-fold than the general population. I think it's just important for us to recognize that maybe we are sharing some of the genetics that our family members have had, and we look the same as they do, but we don't want to feel the same as they do. And so at that time, we go and seek an evaluation.
It's been joked about, everyone has that family member that is a little offset. And maybe, possibly, no one knew what really was going on with that individual, right? And so it was never addressed, and it was joked about and laughed about, but maybe there was something there. How much does fear play a role in people getting the help that they need, or um, even being diagnosed?
I think fear can play a pretty big role for a lot of people, particularly when it comes to stigma about mental health. It could be a societal or cultural or familial stigma or a personal bias against seeking treatment. It could be this fear of being perceived as weak um, by seeking out mental health help. Um, or it could be yeah, just viewed in a negative light for some people. And so there, I can understand why for some individuals with depression, if there are these stigmas surrounding them, then maybe it's challenging to think about the fact that, okay, maybe I do need to seek professional help. Some of the things they're battling, they've never told anyone. And so it could be very scary or very intimidating to open up to a professional who is a person you just met, and now they're asking you all these things about your life.
And so we talked about different types of depression. Can we just touch a little bit on different types of treatment?
Individual therapy is very great. Individual therapy looks like short-term or long-term with a qualified professional, whether that's a psychologist or a licensed professional counselor, or an intern that is on their way to becoming one of those two types of professionals, but is being supervised by a licensed professional. Short-term therapy can be, anywhere from 10 to 18 sessions, and that long-term therapy goes beyond that. But individual therapy takes on different approaches. All clinicians aren't created equal, right? And so I may look at an individual's case different from my counterparts, but the goal is to be able to take in the whole person, not just what they're experiencing at that time. And we also have group therapy where there may be a common issue, maybe a DBT group, debilitating factors in language are talked about, and how that plays its role in depression. And it helps a person pay attention to the things that they're accepting, which may be those negative thoughts and those negative emotions that may be maintaining the feelings of depression. You can seek psychiatric help, and this is always a misconception, right? Do I go to a psychologist or a psychiatrist? Well, a psychologist is not always able to prescribe medication. It's most common that they're not going to prescribe medication, but a psychiatrist can, right? And so the psychiatrist, just like the psychologist, will see the client, do an evaluation to get that background information to see the whole person. And then based off the information that's gathered, recommend some medications that can alleviate some of the negative feelings that the person is experiencing. So the psychiatrist coupled with the psychologist is more effective than either one of those two treatments by themselves.
You look at the situation with Naomi Judd and other individuals. I'm just using Naomi Judd as an example right now, because she came out a few years ago about battling depression, and she had suicidal thoughts before, and now at what, 76 years old, she followed through with this. Does that ever go away, or do you, once someone has articulated the possibility or the desire of harming themselves or taking their life, is that always there? should the loved one always be on the lookout for that?
Thoughts about suicide are a little bit more episodic. They will experience these thoughts, and then whenever they are able to get help and kind of address kind of where some of these thoughts are coming from, they do go away and they're done. For some other people, they have what we would call chronic suicidality, where they have suicidal thoughts all the time. They are episodic, they are, but they do come back, they do persist. And, you know, sometimes difficult times can make them worse. Sometimes lack of activity can make them worse. And they will experience some more of those thoughts. Some people do live with it on a regular basis. Some people do need more help with it. And whenever they find that they are feeling the need to do something about those thoughts, I think that's where the warning flags start flying. When somebody feels like they need to do something about these suicidal thoughts, because I do think it is pretty common during the pandemic for people to have thoughts that are kind of pointing toward suicide, but not really walking toward suicide.
Sometimes people really struggle with suicidal ideation for long period of time before they even really start telling others that they've had this. So recognizing that, you know, as we're helping others who are really struggling with it, that we won't necessarily always know the full picture immediately.
Like when there's a risk of safety, harm to self or someone else, you can go to a hospital, an emergency room, or a behavioral health center. And they can recommend that you come into the hospital a couple of days a week and you stay there for a few hours a day and receive treatment for a certain amount of time until they opine or recommend that you don't need that type of treatment anymore.
For the individual who is battling, like if you tell them, you know, I'm going to get help for you because you need it and there's nothing I can do for you at this point, does that bring their stress level like really high?
Essentially, we can only be there as much as that other person allows us to be there for them. And we, like Genevieve said, we won't always know the extent to the thoughts that they're battling. We can only be there for them if they trust us enough to share that information, to be vulnerable, to overcome that fear or stigma. I think most of the time, taking a humble stance, trying to let go of your ego and just admit that you need more than I can give you right now, and that's not because you're too much. It's because I care for you, and I'm not enough for what you need right now. And kind of taking that humble approach and saying that, like, you want to come alongside them and provide them with all that they need.
I think the untrained person should recognize the cues or the signs of someone who is near a suicide attempt or at that breaking point, like giving their things away or making sure that the medications that are in the house are locked up so that they're not, the person who's battling these suicidal thoughts or feelings aren't taking high doses of their medication at lethal amounts. So almost just making sure things are organized in a way that if things become different, then you can recognize it. Also for the caretaker, just knowing that there are resources through the local community services board where a person, a trained professional can come out and do an evaluation on a person, and the person doesn't have to go anywhere. Who's battling depression, they can stay at home, but then the trained professional will come to their house.
I never thought about clinicians and counselors and those who are listening and they're trying to help these individuals, right? It could be a lot to take in and detach yourselves from. So how do you do that? How do you not get personal with each person that you encounter.
For me personally, at least, I usually always love to have some degree of separation, that when I'm at work and I'm focused and I'm with the people that I'm working with. And once I leave that space, once I leave the building, when I'm turning off the light switch, for example, in the room I'm working with, that's an act of me kind of leaving what I'm working with here. And I think for me, at least, that provides me some separation. That compassion fatigue in our field is a real thing. And certainly seeing, multiple clients struggling with suicidality is really tough, and certainly does have a heavier weight than working with people dealing with other things. So I think, there's that aspect of also really knowing for each of us personally how we need to care for ourselves and what we each need when we leave that therapy room. So
Kind of going off of that, I think also it's I think something to note that therapists have therapists. So that's a place where people can also, if they have some things that are like weighing on them heavily from sessions, that if they need to process like their emotional state about it, they can also talk to like their own therapist, of course, without like breaking any kind of confidentiality, like focusing like on their emotional state of like their reaction to whatever it was that happened.
Thank you again for your participation. I appreciate the fact that you take time out of your busy schedules to get the word out and to help educate the public. I hope that our next discussion, we can look more into the misconceptions surrounding mental illness, particularly depression. We touched on it a little bit, but I think people need to see as many sides of this as possible, because I believe the more we present to the public, someone is going to be able to identify with something. Someone's going to be able to say that, oh, I thought that person was just being lazy, or I thought that person didn't have any ambition. And then you hopefully will couple that with compassion. And like I've said before, whether they're having a bad day or they are really battling a mood disorder, if we are able to extend a little more compassion and grace toward one another, it's a win-win situation for everyone. What have we lost if we just approach people with a little more compassion?
I always think about like that, the analysis of Winnie the Pooh, like Eeyore was there. Eeyore was like the walking embodiment of depression, and they didn't try to fix him. He didn't try to mask it. He was just there, and they still included him anyway. And I think that that is something I think that would be really cool if we got to.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I like what you said about it uses up a lot of energy, right? To mask it. And doesn't that just compound the problem even more, right? That they're just working so hard to appear normal when they are normal. I learned a lot today just listening and talking with you all, what you go through and what you have to also work with as well. And so again, I say thank you for your participation, and thank you for sharing.